Now that we got the bike running, it doesn't seem to be running the best. It's very fuely smelling. Also a bit of engine oil smoke coming out. What I'd like to do now, we'll check the plugs. We'll lower the fuel pressure from 52 psi down to about 40 because I think that'll be more suited to those larger injectors that we're running. We'll use a dial gauge, set up the TDC marks on the rotor to suit 1 and 4 cylinder. Then we'll know that the wolf knows whereabouts it is. Also we'll do 2 and 3 as well, triple checking that they're correct. We'll balance the throttle bodies, look down the plug holes, make sure it all looks correct with the bore scope. Also, I'll stick the bore scope where the O2 sensor goes in the dump pipe, just to make sure that the turbo isn't leaking engine oil into the exhaust system and making it smoke. We'll make an idle map up to suit the big injectors, and then we better have a look at the compression. So we'll do a compression test. With the spark plugs out, they definitely look very sooty. Hopefully it's the overfueling causing them to do that, not the engine burning oil. Let's have a look down the bores with a bore scope. It appears that cylinders 2 and 3, the center two, seem to have scuffing marks in line with the gudgeon pins. They don't run normal circlips in the pistons, they ran these Teflon buttons, and I'm wondering if it's got something to do with those. Also the top of the piston, which this is piston number 2, he does look quite oily. I'm not sure if it's oil or if it's just that excessive fuel that I've been pumping into it. So we'll continue on and see what happens. I've got the snap-on scope. I'll put it in the hole where the oxygen sensor goes, and I've had a bit of a look at the turbo. And I can see that inside here, it's not leaking oil, it's not full of oil in the dump pipe. With a bit of luck, it's just ultra rich, making it run like the choke stuck on. I've got the rotor fitted back on. I've put some extra marks on it. Timing lights all plugged in. I've made up a map for testing the ignition timing just on 0 degree advance, so then I can calibrate the pickup sensor to the wolf. That's what I'll do now. The number 69, where the arrow is the initial setup trim number that I put in the ECU years and years ago. I thought I'd done it correct, but there must have been a parameter, I suppose, being active, which made it not read correct, because now that I've properly zeroed out all the numbers, that number needs to be 47 degrees. Basically saying that all my ignition values were 22 degrees out. So when I thought the bike was idling at 22 degrees, let's say, it actually had 0 degrees ignition advance at idle. I've calibrated the crank trigger to the wolf. Now what I've done is I've made a really mild ignition map. I've done the same to the fueling map because it's basically fouling the spark plugs as soon as I start it. And I'll also drop that fuel pressure back to about 40 psi. Then we'll probably have a crack at seeing if it runs. Okay, here we go. We'll rip back the bike cover, connect up the laptop, put the plugs in, and see if we can make the bike run a bit better with a bit more ignition advance down low. Hopefully we can get this bike to sound better, because the last time it was running, it was really quite bad. I've checked the bolt that holds the rotor on is tight, the cover's on. Before we attempt to start it, I want to drop that fuel pressure back from 52 psi to 40 psi. So let's adjust the pressure regulator, try and lower that pressure. Okay, that's a bit low, dial it up a bit. Slightest bit more and it'll be done. Perfect. Doesn't seem to be as solid as with a higher pressure. I might just experiment to see if 45 psi is more stable. The fuel pressure seems to be a lot more stable at 45 psi for some reason. Whether it's my gauge that's fluctuating a bit or not, I'll call it a day and set our base fuel pressure at 45 psi. So I've modified the ignition map. I've pulled 50% of the fuel out of the injection. Let's see if it'll run. It seems to run a lot better. Let's back the idle off a bit. Let's start the bike again and try and synchronize the throttle bodies. It's running way different with the timing fixed with the 50% fuel removed. I've had to also back the idle off a long way. That's how bad it was running before. High, 4's low. What seems to be happening is all my linkages in my throttle bodies seem to be binding up. So when I adjust the adjuster screws, it's not doing it correctly. I wonder if it was when I painted it, whether the paint is making it all bind up a little bit. Today's task of synchronizing the throttle bodies dragged out a lot longer than what it should. Basically, I was chasing my tail. The more I adjusted them, the further out of synchro they were getting. I couldn't get it back to where it wanted to be. What I found in the end was the paint, when I painted the throttle bodies, had worked its way into some of these linkages and was making them bind and stick on each other, and I couldn't actually adjust them correctly with the synchronizing screws. So anyway, I ended up using some WD-40 and backing the screws right out, getting them all to operate correctly. We're able to start the bike, made a pretty flat fuel map just to make it idle correct. I found there's a massive difference between 1.5 milliseconds and 1.6 or 1.7. Even though it's a small number, it makes a huge difference. So that was all good to be able to sort that out. At the end of the day, I dialed the fueling in at idle just by ear. The ignition table was adjusted. We ended up with about 18 degrees, I reckon, at idle. The engine heats up a lot nicer. I struggled to get temp in it before, like it just was that retarded in the timing and it was that rich. The bike struggled to get up to over 50 degrees and it just, you've seen it in the last video, it was horrible. So now there's no smoke from the exhaust. It idles with a lower throttle opening. So the throttle itself with the idle screw doesn't need to be as far open. The motor wants to run on less throttle, which is great. So let's start her up, have a listen to it. so there's no smoke like before, where it would just chook smoke and it almost looked like it was burning engine oil. So much better. I'm very happy how the bike runs down low. It probably hasn't ran that good in its whole life at idle. So what we'll do next is have a bit of a clean up in here, write up a new list, make a plan of what we're going to do next.